questions. So in general, I want to kind of like frame the conversation in kind of like two big buckets. One bucket being how to become a better designer, and then the other bucket being how to become a better leader. So I'll start with uh, becoming a better designer. So um, you all know that I like to talk a lot about like how to set yourself apart as a designer. But one of the things that a lot of the time I assume when saying that is that you've already got most of the actual design skills to even just like hit the basic bar of being qualified to be a designer, right? So on top of that, like once you've hit that point, then you can kind of start showing like what is your advantage in comparison to other peers. But something that I have kind of noticed is that sometimes like I'm making that assumption, and like the first step for a designer to actually make is to just make sure that like they have the hard skills and that they are capable of doing the basic design work itself. So something that I wanted to um, talk about a little bit today, and it came up in some of the questions, is how do you start doing that, right? Because like I mean, design is it's kind of infinite. Like there's every flavor of design. Um, but something that I've noticed in portfolios is, and I did the same exact thing early in my career, uh, was a lot of kind of one-off thinking, uh, opening up a sketch file and then just starting completely from scratch and doing every single little component from scratch. Like you're a lot of people are drawing toolbars from scratch, creating hamburger menus from scratch, creating card styles from scratch, margins from scratch, buttons from scratch. And when you when you do that, you open yourself up to a lot more scrutiny, because now in addition to evaluating the end-to-end flow, you're opening up a lot of opportunities to be evaluated for visual design gaps. And even if the mock is okay, if there's an inconsistency in your primary button and second button on one page versus another page, you've opened yourself up to being scrutinized to that. Um, because instead of simply evaluating like how you're doing as a UX designer and how do you create the interactions in like a 4-page flow, I'm also like dinging you for like, okay, like that, like this person's not a design system thinker. Like they're gonna need to learn about that. So one tactical way that I recommend for people to a tactical and easy way to start kind of like um, getting your feet a little wet with design systems is download both iOS guidelines and material guidelines have like downloadable sketch packs or Figma packs or whatever it is that you use. And then just explore those to see how like don't pay as much attention to like what a button looks like and whether or not you like it, because that's not the point. The point is pay attention to all the different components that like a basic design system consists of. And there's different ways to do documentation around that, right? Like you can make a document, you can do a cut sheet, which is another way of just saying like a PDF. You could do like measurements, and then whoever the designer is that picks it up ends up like doing them with the values inside of the PDF. um, but the point being that like it's like you have one style and then that has to permeate across your entire, for example, mobile app. And then that same thinking should apply to anything you work on, like whether it's a website or um, like anything with a screen, really. Like I remember when I worked on the Echo Show, that's a completely one-off product with a screen, right? Like it's not an Android product. Like the thing completely has its own custom stack of patterns, but that still had a super strict design system that it worked within. So when you do that preemptively, um, it'll, before you even start doing the design on the product, or like before you transition to like doing high fidelity design on your product, um, like it's already going to result in a cleaner design experience. So uh, yeah, so if you just download, like for example, the iOS kit, the Android kit, whatever is more your jam, and then take your portfolio pieces and then run them through the lens of like, okay, like how does this compare to the actual stock design system? And then if you rebuild your app or whatever your portfolio piece is, it could also be a website, through the lens of that design system, and then compare and contrast what like the stock experience looked like to your experience. And a lot of the time, like especially if you're a little bit earlier on in your design career, you'll find that just like using the stock patterns, you might stare at it and be like, I don't understand why this looks better than mine. And it has nothing to do with the actual visual design, and it has everything to do with consistent math. So that's the next thing that you'll start to notice is like that stock design systems come out of the box with like preset math. So things like margins, right? Like buttons based off of a grid, mature type ramps. Like it's an easy way to start like messing around with these things and getting exposed to them. So like once you've gotten your feet wet with messing around with the stock design system and comparing and contrasting, um, uh, and contrasting, then you can actually start. Then like you'll be a little bit more warmed up to dive deeper um, into uh, what makes a good set of margins, right? And spoiler, it's not a specific pixel value because resolutions will differ on different devices. So like you'll have jump off points to, because like now you've been exposed to like, okay, so this is what Apple's type ramp looks like. Now go read up on type ramps, right? Because you've kind of warmed up to it. You might notice that like material guidelines have spacing rules, right? Now go dive into spacing rules. And material, by the way, has like amazing documentation on why they do everything. And then after having gone through that exercise and like reading up on even just iOS and Android, you'll also like be speaking the same language. So when you're in an interview now, when someone asks you, what's your point of view on responsive versus adaptive design? Like because you went through the documentation, like you at least understand what that language is speaking to. I'm gonna pause there. Any questions about that section?
Yeah, I have a question. From which stage do you start to consider about these margins, those consistency, like from the very beginning or the mid-fi?
That's a great question. Um, so I like to start thinking about it once I've aligned on a basic UX model. So after low fidelity wireframes. So at that point, like once because the hard part and where I think as like a true product designer, like the bulk of your thinking should be kind of like in the skeletal, you know, boxes, because that's when you're identifying like what is the super high level model that we should be pursuing. You know, like what if I'm making a magazine, whatever, is it a blog style? Is it a flipboard style where it's like completely custom? Or maybe it's some kind of like micro content product that feels like Twitter, something like, right? Like three fundamentally different problems. So at that time, it's not appropriate to really get into any level of detail, but it takes a long time to like align around that. Well, it should take a long time to align around that really high level UX model question. And that is actually one of the things that a lot of designers don't mature well into. And it ends up being a gap for a very long time, if not ever. Like I've worked with a lot of designers that like are senior, but still don't go through that high level exercise of just like, what are the really high level possibilities of like what routes we can take. And by the way, this is a cheat code to making yourself sound like the smartest person in the room, is like when people go straight into like thinking of like a specific solution or talking about a specific competitor, being the one that takes everyone in the room like a step or two back, bringing it back to the problem, and just being like, okay, before we talk about, like getting really detailed into like this one solution, I'll write this down as one of the possibilities, and what other high level models can we come up with, right? And in that way, you just started an impromptu brainstorm. And the person on the other side of that might be just one person, might just be like one PM you're working with or one client you're working with, right? It applies to the agency world as well. Like your client might have like a very specific idea for like, hey, I saw, Apple came out with this walkie-talkie thing and I want to do the same thing. It's like, okay, that's great. Let's put it on the whiteboard. What's the problem that you're trying to do with this walkie-talkie? Bam. Like now you actually have like the thing that you're trying to solve. Well, what other ideas can we come up with to solve this problem that your walkie-talkie solution attempts to solve? And bam, 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 you can come up with, several ideas. So just like paring it back and having people like stare at a whiteboard a bit, it forces them to think about the actual problem as opposed to getting tempted to think about the pixels. Once you've gone through that exercise, right? You, out of 5 options, you picked one option, then you went to the next stage and fleshed out the actual workflow and figured out all the pages involved. You have some really low fidelity wires. At that point, it's appropriate to either do a high fidelity round of wireframes where it's still just like gray boxes and you're not applying styling, or identifying your design system first and then going straight into high fidelity. So that depends a little bit more on the organization that you work in, and also what you want to do, right? Because like in doing that design system, like you can make the argument that you're jumping the gun because you haven't even gotten all the details of the workflow down yet. But the thing that it allows you to do is, before getting into like, pixel perfect presentations, it also gives you the opportunity to start establishing the brand at a low fidelity, right? Because like you just made some alignment on the product side, and you're like, hey, like here's a couple different directions that we can take, with the product, but in also like starting to work on the design system, you can have the same level of conversation about like, what do we want the app to feel like? So you can create some basic style boards where you just like whatever, throw up some color palettes, and some maybe like app inspiration to identify like, okay, like what do we want this thing to feel like? And then once you've identified what you roughly want it to feel like, if you decide to create that design system, like in applying it just like to a mock or two, you can send it to your partners to evaluate while you are working through like the rest of your workflow. So like I guess what I'm saying is you end up creating 2 parallel work streams, because either way you're going to be figuring out like what are all the details of the product and what are all the product requirements that I have to create, while at the same time starting the conversation of like, what's this thing supposed to look like in high fidelity? And when you do that right, and you kind of have to just do it a couple of times to get a good rhythm, there's potential to save a lot of time. And people always notice when you save time, because otherwise, if you think of design like more linearly, that just means that you're stretching it out further, right? Because like now you're saying very rigidly that I'm going to go through this, strictly UX architecture exercise. It's going to take 3 weeks, and then it's going to take another 2 weeks to do alignment around visual design, and then But when you attempt to do them in parallel, you can save time. I'm a big fan of figuring out how to do stuff in parallel.
Yeah, I think it resonates with me a lot when I'm doing an app design. After high fidelity, we found that many components are not aligned, and we are really
Mm-hmm.
messy around about putting the components in the design system file and then refine it again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is really helpful.
Yeah, and I think like to me it's really helpful to think of it as a parallel work stream as opposed to a part of the same project.
Yeah.
Like to me it's a part of like going above and beyond as a designer, because it's one of those steps that's easy to skip if you lack like strong peers, like if you lack like another designer that will push you to do it, or if you lack a design manager that knows to ask for it, or if you lack a PM that's worked with enough designers to know that they're missing that step. Like it's easy to skip it, but then it generally always results in a messier product, because then you're looking at everything mock by mock or page by page, as opposed to thinking about the UX flow in isolation, right? Then it forces you to not think about the styling that you're putting into it, and then separately thinking about how to create stylable design, scalable design systems that you'll be able to pick from over time. Another really cool thing that I like about taking that extra time on the front end to start a design system, like on any product that you work on, is that as you add more features, you already know what your patterns are going to be. You're pulling the same field that you already did on another page. You're pulling the same drop down. You're pulling the same button. You're pulling the same margins and spacing and etc.
Yuri, can I ask a question? Oh, I'm sorry. Sabrina, were you?
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, you can go first.
Okay.
I've already asked many questions.
Oh, no, it's all right. Thank you. It's kind of going off what we were just talking about. So when you talk about, you mentioned that different organizations, have a different process. How do you say we're interviewing and the company asks us about our process? How do we just talk about what we think we would do, or or what we do, or how do you work around that, since
That's a
everybody,
great
you know
question.
what I mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I know exactly what you mean, because it's tempting to think that there's like a right answer that your interviewing is that your interviewer is trying to kind of gotcha with, like, oh, well, you missed this step, so you don't know what you're talking about. But that's really not what it's about. So when someone's probing into what your process is, ideally you should have like something simple enough to where you can remember it when you're nervous. So I used to have this really intense design process that I would share, that had to do with, how does the product journey overlap with sprint planning and stuff. But what I realized was, unless I had the artifact on the screen giving me stuff to kind of like point at and giving me like ledges to hang on to, I'd forget about it. Because like at the end of the day, it's just in the real world, like design process is fluid, because like you rarely start from the beginning and then go all the way to the end. Like a lot of the time when you're given a design process, you're thrown somewhere in the middle of something that's already kind of rolling. So in a really awesome kind of like mentorship session with like this really high up at Amazon, well, it turned into a mentorship session. I don't think he meant for it to be a mentorship session. I came to the realization that like the simpler something is, the more realistically you'll actually apply it to your work. So I came up with this with my design process then, which became plan, design, deliver, which is a lot easier to explain than, do your discovery phase, then do your partner alignment, then do your concepting, then do your prototyping, then do your usability, then do your prototyping, then like you know, it's a lot easier to and it's true to me that it's just like, it's just plan, design, deliver, right? Like I spend a bunch of time in planning what it is that we're going to work on, and I talk to all my partners, make sure I have everything I need. Design, it also incorporates prototyping, testing, because research is a part of design. And deliver, like a third of launching a product is actually supporting the engineering of a product that they already agreed to building, right? And like, and so, and that is my design process. So like there isn't like a design process I can tell you like, hey, adopt this. It's actually more about like what you'll find to be your own design process, and then take the time to actually like reflect and write down what did and didn't work for you. And also write down the things that you thought were a part of your design process but aren't nearly as important as you thought they were. Like for example, like I see a lot of people spending a lot of time talking about personas and user journeys, right? In the real world, like when you're like brought into a project halfway through it, like that's not really a part of the design process. Like those are tools for due diligence, but that's not really the design process. So like think less about the tools and more just about how you get stuff done. And when you think what is the design process to you, you're more likely to come up with a unique point of view that'll engage your you know, in the future, your interviewers into like having like an actual conversation, as opposed to, you know, just a dry, like, do you know it or not type of thing. Does
Thank you
that
so
answer?
much. Oh,
Does that
yes,
answer
yes.
your question? Okay, cool.
Yep, because I had like a practice interview, and that was one of the questions, and I felt like I just was like talking and talking and talking and just going in
Yeah,
circles.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's very easy to end up talking and talking in if you haven't done that thinking ahead of time. So even even more awkward than doing that over the phone, when you don't actually know what your own design process is when you get past the phone screen, right? And then at any one of the big companies, let's say you get through the second interview, which is also a phone interview, but now with, you know, someone that's actually in it as opposed to a recruiter. And then you get to the final interview, and one of the exercises is a whiteboard exercise. And the point of a whiteboard exercise is to force you to apply your design process and show how you use it, right? And even for me, like today, right, and I've been doing this a long time, it's really tricky to do it on a whiteboard, because it forces you to take what would probably, you know, be 2-3 weeks worth of like thinking in pieces, and condensing it into like a 5-minute thing where you just like make bullet points of like, well, here's what I would do, and here's my criteria for how I'd pick what the right thing is to do. So it's really important to ask yourself what your design process is, and then actually like try writing it down. And in writing it down, you'll find the gaps of like, well, I feel like there's like something really missing here, and I know people are going to ask here. And then that gives you a jump off point to go learn about that thing that is missing in your design process.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
I wanted to add something on that, because that was a really good question. Would help when thinking about your design process, because I'm reflecting that right now. Does it also help understanding what you mentioned earlier, like what makes you unique as a designer? So for example, my design process, I observe through the lens of situational impairments. So when I'm problem solving, I kind of give that unique lens of observing those human behaviors. But I noticed that I'm more of exploratory, and would taking that time to reflect help understand your design process?
Yeah, it definitely will. A lot of that like is kind of like next level thinking. And what I mean by next level, like, is like you should have kind of like your most core basic process that is like just realistically how you do the actual pixel pushing. And then you have the additional layer of like, what impacts my thinking inside of this project. And that's going to be like more from your narrative and your background. So like, you know, thinking about, like in your case, thinking about like accessibility to an extreme, right? For me, it's embracing ambiguity and running towards it as opposed to away from it, right? Like, but embracing ambiguity doesn't necessarily answer, like for me at least, or whatever, embracing accessibility doesn't necessarily speak to like, okay, but what are like the fundamental parts of like a basic design process, right? So what I would say is like, figure out what your fundamental like tasks are in your design process. And when I mean tasks, I don't mean like incremental little tiny things like user interviews. I mean like big bucket things like whatever your version of, you know, discovery or validation or like big words is. And then think of like your narrative as being what influences each of those buckets. Like how does your narrative color your, you know, discovery phase? How does your narrative color your concepting phase? How does how does your narrative color your validation phase, right? So you don't, does that answer your question?
It does. It did. Thank you.
Awesome. Let's see. So fortunately we're using Zoom, so I've got 10 minutes left. Another question that was asked is how do you, on the better designer theme, and then I'll kind of jump into more leadership-y type stuff. So on becoming a better designer, how do you continue to challenge yourself to grow? So an easy way not easy way, it's actually very hard, but a tactical way that I do that to myself without going out of my way to go read a bunch of posts and books is whenever I see an opportunity that looks terrifying and I don't yet know how to do it, I just raise my hand and say that I'll do it. So, you know, sometimes that's and that's not just like at a day job, that's like everywhere. So like early on, I did that with client work. I would take client projects that when I'd see them, I'd be like, there's no way I could do this. But after taking them, guess what? I did them, right? Because like once you commit to it and you put yourself in the awkward situation where like, you know, you're like, shit, I said I'd do it. I don't know how to do it. I don't think I can do it, but I got to do it. So you figure it out. All right. And then the same thing goes in day jobs when you see something in your periphery going on where whatever, like maybe there's some like company emergency that came up because they have some weird thing happening, like some system getting deprecated because they're being forced to, or maybe there's like a culture shift because you just lost your VP of design. And so like there's a bunch of chaos everywhere. Like it's tempting to kind of like look at those moments and then get sucked into the chaos, when in reality, a lot of the time that is when you have the opportunity to raise your hand and be like, hey, you know, I noticed a bunch of people just left this project. You know, I've got some extra bandwidth. I can help with some of those things until, you know, you get a backfill for those roles or something. And like when everything's good and you raise your hand like that, usually people will brush you off because they're like, just don't worry about it, right? Like we're staffed. But when there's like chaos going on and you see some weird gap and you're like, hey, I can help with that a little bit, right? It gives you an opportunity to actually jump in and do some work that has nothing to do with what you're supposed to be doing. Same thing goes for like, especially like internal job openings. So like, I like to tell people like, be humble with the external, like external stuff that you do when you're applying. look for any way to get into a company to just get your foot in the door, but then be the opposite once you're inside of the company. Once you have a single good review, you should be aggressive about getting the best job that you could possibly get there. Because once you got a single good review, like it's really easy to just like navigate and get your dream job.
You're talking about big organizations specifically, right?
So that's more on kind of the larger organization side. So on the smaller organization, well, before I get into that, because I can also speak how to do it when you don't have a bunch of jobs to choose from, right? Any questions so far? All right, I'll talk about smaller organizations now. And this is a great segue into becoming a better leader. So a question I've been getting a lot is like, what is the difference between, you know, just being a designer and being a senior designer? Like, it's like this ephemeral, sexy thing that no one actually understands what it is, but everyone wants it. Like, and a lot of people like to just give them the label. I remember one day I was like, F it, I'm a senior designer. And I changed my LinkedIn to say senior designer before I even got promoted. And what I've come to realize is that getting to being a senior, and I know that like most of you are like earlier in your career, like even in the group that most folks are pretty early, but I think it's really important to like start thinking about it immediately, because it's the type of thing that you can start doing immediately. Like you can start having senior tendencies like immediately, because they have they don't have so much to do with the design as much they do asking like the right questions. So in a smaller organization, to your point, when there isn't a lot of room to just like apply for like another position on another team, you make one for yourself. And the way that you make one for yourself is by introducing structures that you would assume a leader would put together to make it possible to do that kind of work. So what that means is, like, for example, like let's say you want to work on new product, right? But you're on a small design team and you guys maintain an existing product. How would you do that if there isn't a team that's doing, you know, skunkworks R&D? The way that you do that is you create a mechanism and you get your team on board to saying like, hey, like we should have a vision work stream. Like design should have a point of view on what our product looks like, let's say 3 years from now. But we don't know what that is, right? So then you draft like what you see like a high level, like a vision charter saying that, hey, like as a design team, we agree that our team is missing a point of view on what our product is going to look like 3 years from now. We'd like to go through a design exercise on the side to do some thinking around future state. And then you pitch that to your leadership. 9 times out of 10, they're going to be ecstatic that you're thinking long term. And now you've got the green light to go do that thing, right? So you do it on the side, then you present it to your leadership. Whether or not it's the right thing, they're going to be they'll be impressed that you're going through the design exercise to think longer term, right? And because you created this entire thing, guess what? You just carved yourself out a role for being the only designer that is thinking about the future of the company. So now you can come back and ask, like, hey, can I spend more time on this thing? And can I get a junior designer reporting into me? I think this should get more attention, and you know, do that for several months, and you have yourself a small team, and you are now a manager. working on the thing that you actually wanted to do, which is cutting edge, you know, new stuff. So that's how you navigate inside of like a smaller organization, is you build the role for yourself as opposed to applying for it.
Yeah, I noticed that there's like less than 1 minute for the meeting. Alert.
Any final questions before we adjourn? Sorry, I know we're ending a little early, but I didn't think we'd be using Zoom. All right, y'all. If you have any others, feel free to message me directly. I'll try my best to answer them via chat or just like in this event's comments. Thank you for your participation and showing up, everyone. I'll see you around the group.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.